The Gospel of the Lord. The Gospel today for me is both very consoling and deeply challenging. It's consoling because it reminds me of how profoundly God loves and cares for each and every one of us. And it's challenging because precisely rooted in that dignity that we are imbued with from God is a mission and a challenge to proclaim His truth. And that can be profoundly uncomfortable. This weekend, yesterday was the 5th anniversary of my ordination as a priest, and looking at some of the photos from the ordination celebration that we had right here in Holy Rosary, I realized how much more hair I had back then. So I think I must be in God's good grace because I'm taking up less of His time having to count the hairs on my head as of late. But what a powerful image that Jesus uses, that God counts the hairs on our head. Even those of you with children couldn't fathom the number of hairs on your child's head. So how intimately, how close God's knowledge of us is. Far surpassing how we can know ourselves or know anyone else. And I believe that Jesus gives that image to the 12 as He continues to tell them to do not be afraid, precisely because He's inviting them to understand the beauty of who they are so that they can be who they are in the world, even in moments when the world will not understand, will not accept, may even reject or oppress them. And that's a challenging truth to really internalize because most of us spend a lot of our lives trying to find acceptance and belonging. As we spend a lot of time trying to conform to things so that we can fit in. It's not just something that happens on the playground. It's something that lasts most of our lifetime, wondering what others are thinking and judging about me. Am I accepted? Am I loved? Do I belong? Well, I think right now in our world, all that's taking place clearly surfaces the challenges of reflecting on the significance of our individual and our collective identities. And so it's brought to mind some memories of my own childhood. And of course, I was born and raised here in New Mexico, but ethnically, I'm Italian, Hungarian, German. And so I think I was probably in first grade, at least very, very young in elementary school. And we had this assignment to bring in a cultural food from our background for an activity at school. So I brought pierogies, like these Eastern European kind of dumpling things, kind of like a ravioli. And the teacher said, these aren't cultural foods. And I said, well, what is a cultural food? She's like, well, tamales or pozole or enchiladas or sopaipillas or something like that. And I realized that my culture didn't fit. And I was really distressed. And I so badly wanted to fit in. So a few days later, my mother finds me, and I had collected all of the brown markers that I had, and I started coloring myself. Because I used to be like really güerito, like more than I am now. Like I was a towhead, like I had bright blonde hair and very light eyes. And my mother found me, and she's like, what are you doing? And I explained, I said, I want to look like the other kids. And that was the first lecture I got on white privilege at the age of 6. But it was through those experiences that I began to realize how easy it is to make assumptions about each other based on these external things, that don't really honor who we are as individuals or who the other is. Because if God has counted my hairs, he's counted your hairs too. If he's made me to be me, he's made you to be you. And the challenge of what it is to truly honor and accept that identity. Not in a way that tears others down or say that you don't belong because I do, but says precisely because I desire to belong, I must make a place for you. And that's a huge struggle for most of us. I have a very good friend who lives in Minneapolis, who's African American. And the death of George Floyd and his murder has weighed very heavily upon him. And so he asked me a few weeks back, he said, is there something I could read that might help me figure out how to integrate the pain I'm feeling so it can do something constructive? So a text that was very powerful for me years ago is a book that's decades old called The Wounded Healer by a priest named Henry Nouwen. And I recommended it to him. And he read it. And he said, the problem is the struggles that this author faced aren't my struggles. So I get what he's talking about, that like we can take the adversity we faced in life and do something meaningful with it, that doesn't have to be something that we hide and shame from, but it's actually something that can empower us. He said, but he hasn't had to experience a lifetime, if not generations, of prejudice and rejection and oppression. And my friend also is a survivor of sexual abuse. He said, what do I do with that? What do I do with these things that for me feel shameful but shouldn't be? That are just part of my story, part of my identity. And I said, well, maybe the fact that you're asking these questions, what is the value of the struggles of my life, not only for myself, but for the sake of the world? That those are the questions we're not asking enough. We're facing very complicated situations and trying to find very simple answers. And I think the shooting amidst the protests not too long ago in Old Town is a demonstration of that. Of how confused we become as a community and as a society when we're trying just to either erase a part of ourselves that feels shameful, that we think shouldn't belong so we conform, or we're trying to reject someone else simply because of who they are. There aren't easy answers, but the challenge we're called to is to begin to walk into those spaces having the confidence and trust to ask the questions, because we know that the dignity we are imbued with by God surpasses any of the prejudices and divisions that we carry. Now, you notice in the gospel, Jesus doesn't tell us, God counts all the hairs on your head and therefore there's no suffering or trial or tribulation. He compares us to the sparrows that have an infinite value and says, we're even more valuable to God than them. But he doesn't say God protects them always and comforts them and keeps them from harm. He says when they fall, God knows of it, that God is with them. He says that the things that he has spoken to us in the darkness, we are called to proclaim in the light. And so it's precisely in those spaces of our lives that we feel that we are falling, that we feel that we are shrouded in darkness, that we feel that there is no hope, when we find God's presence in there affirming us and saying, in this moment, you matter. In this moment, you have value. When we can find that, then we know a truth that surpasses even ourselves that we can proclaim and share. But it's only when we're willing to admit our own insecurity, our own weakness, our own shame. I think the most recent profound example of this is, I'm sure many of you have heard the Supreme Court upheld the current deferred action for childhood arrivals DACA legislation to allow hundreds of thousands of immigrants in our communities to be able to continue to stay and work who had come as children. One of the lawyers who argued that case is himself a DACA recipient. And he was able to speak truth and fight for justice because he himself has known the difficulty of what it was to assert that he had value. But because he could do so, at least for the foreseeable future, hundreds of thousands of other young people in our communities are able to say the same. So when God is counting the hairs on our heads, it's not just to comfort us. It's to say if we discover our value, then we must dedicate our lives to proclaiming the truth of the dignity of our neighbor, whose hairs God has counted just the same.